Hello, welcome everyone who's joining us both in person and remotely to a session that feels a bit like a support concert before the headliner, which will be the conversation between Matt, Cory Doctorow, and Audrey Tang. In our session, we are meant to cover quite a broad conceptual territory. The themes are information flows, data deposits, or more broadly, data governance, and privacy-enhancing technologies. Let me maybe start by introducing our panel. With us today, firstly joining us online is Sylvie Delacroix from the University of Birmingham, Morshed Mannan from European University Institute in Florence, Katarzyna Szymielewicz from Panoptykon Foundation, and my name is Alek Tarkowski, and I work at the Open Future Foundation. So I want to start by referring to something that was said earlier in the session. There was a session on the network society, and one of the panelists said that in his opinion there's not a failure of institutions, but the lack of institutions that can properly address some of the challenges that we are facing. And I think in this conversation, a conversation around data governance, we are looking at this issue, but I think from a positive side, from a positive perspective. So basically, there's a lot of debates today on how we could design institutions, broadly speaking, that can provide new forms of data governance. To me, this is very interesting. I am a, so to say, child of the copyright wars. So when I became an activist, when I was 20-something, really the topic that could get everyone have their faces flushed was what to do with MP3s, basically, right? And this was the big debate. Where do we put them? Who is copying them? Is that legal or not? What are the business models? What's ethical or not? And then all these people in my crowd then suddenly started realizing there's something shifting in the world around us. For me, this was when I met Katarzyna, and suddenly everyone was talking about personal data and privacy, and this was an initially subtle shift, and then a tectonic one, I think. By the way, maybe we'll be soon hitting a moment where this will all get synthesized. I see today important debates under the theme of data happening around personal data, health data, but slowly people are also talking about creative works, and there are a lot of parallels. Maybe we'll explore them. But anyway, 2020s, I think, are the year no longer of copyright wars, but of intense debates on how we can govern data. Certainly here in Poland, here in Europe, it is a very big topic of policy debates. But also the sessions today earlier showed that there's a lot of basically grassroots and bottom-up activity. So this panel is meant to explore these issues, and since the space is extremely broad, basically we'll sort of follow the experiences of our panelists, who have some very, I think, interesting and complementary experiences and ideas on how to build these institutions, build these alternatives. So we agreed that we'll start with you, Sylvie. I forgot to mention that you're not only working at the university, but you're the co-founder of the Data Trust Initiative. Data trust is a really strong, big concept in these debates. So I leave it to you to introduce it and share your experiences first.
Thanks. Well, first, I'm thrilled to be here today, and sorry I can't be there in person. I should say that data trust, first I should clarify the fact that a lot of people like the way it sounds. You know, data plus trust sounds good, right? And so it's very tempting to use the words data trust to mean all sorts of things. And so for some time, I mean a few years, progress, I think, when it comes to building bottom-up empowerment infrastructure, when it comes to data, has been slowed down in part because of talking across each other, right? And I think we've made a lot of progress today, not just in the UK. I see a lot of countries, including Canada, Germany, Europe, India actually is super interesting right now, where there starts to be an awareness of the fact that, yes, of course, it's important to have top-down regulation that gives us data rights. Yes, so nobody's going to deny that. The problem is that today these data rights are not used as much as they could, And most importantly, they rely on the idea that we all have the ability to make choices through consent that are often not really choices we can make in full awareness. So we just click away, pop-up windows, etc., and we become increasingly passive when it comes to data governance. And so data trust, the data trust initiative is really all about saying, look, we need to beat this habit of passivity. Why? Because actually, increasingly, data is not just a tool that can leverage economic goods, we thought about that, but it's also a tool, it's a political tool. It's a tool of political empowerment, and a lot of people are missing that. And so the idea behind data trust as bottom-up empowerment infrastructure is to enable groups to pull together the rights they have over their data and to entrust an intermediary, in this case the data trustee, with the exercise of those rights according to the terms of the trust, right? And it's key in this kind of message that there's space for different data trust, right? So we are all different. Some people care a lot more about security, others really want to share their data, say, to better use of natural resources or healthcare, and others may want to maximize financial returns. And you need to make room for a variety of approaches and for people to change their mind and switch from one data trust to another as and when their aspirations change. So I think this is what I really want to emphasize today. It's not theory anymore. Yeah, data trusts are concrete. We've launched the first 3 pilot data trusts in January 2002 at the Data Trust Initiative. If you want more details, you can click datatrust.uk. Now, I really encourage anybody who's interested to get in touch because we very much need and encourage further debate. And we do also need a wide variety of expertise. For instance, one of the key issues today is to think seriously about the sustainability of different types of data trust, right? So some data trust might be focusing on healthcare data, others might be place-based, like we have a data trust that's created for a fishing community in the UK. So yeah, I don't want to talk too long. I just want to, I'm looking forward to questions, and I want to emphasize that this is not theory, it's practice now. And data trusts are one tool in a wider box of bottom-up empowerment infrastructure. And I think we're going to hear about data co-ops as well very shortly.
Indeed. So the second, almost a buzzword, I think, at least in the circles that I frequent, is data cooperatives or data co-ops. The idea itself, the tension is interesting. Co-ops, at least here in Poland and in many places around the world, have a very strong tradition. But when you think a co-op, I think usually maybe an agricultural workers co-op, a musty institution. And here suddenly there's an idea that you can apply the same approach to something as exotic and modern as data. Morshed, you've been studying this concept, so I hope you will tell us more. What's your experience and thoughts about data co-ops?
Thank you very much for this question. So, in my own experience and the way that I started exploring data cooperatives was from a particular angle. I started looking at platform cooperatives more broadly. So looking at alternatives to corporate platforms. For instance, instead of the corporate platform Uber, we look at Uber alternatives that are organized as a cooperative. Now, the idea behind platform worker cooperatives, for instance, is that you turn the Uber driver, for instance, into a member of a cooperative, and by doing so, not only are you able to extend certain type of worker rights that they are otherwise deprived of, but you also give them a democratic control of that cooperative, as by definition. Now, what was really interesting by starting this exploration was that many of these platform cooperatives were actually coming up with ways of handling and managing member data. And so the interesting question was whether many of these platform cooperatives were also data cooperatives. And in some cases, by starting this exploration, we started to discover that there were certain cooperatives that were existing and were starting to, in their own way, without an enabling regulatory framework, to try to handle some of these issues that Sylvie just mentioned as well. Whether that is about, questions about patients, healthcare records, and whether their data could be used in certain ways by research institutions or by the public sector, but also in the context of, for instance, let's say the gig economy, whether by using the data of these drivers, you'd be able to pool it together and help them make better choices about when they offer their work, for instance. And so that led to the spawning of a whole other, category of cooperatives as well. So that is sort of a bit of how I came to be interested in this, but also how we start to see the emergence of these data cooperatives in Europe and outside of Europe as well. Now, just like Sylvie said, with respect to trusts, data cooperative is also a term that is a buzzword because it brings together two words that are very appealing, right? So not only data, but also the word cooperative is also quite loaded, potentially not just for those who know about the cooperative movement, but also in the idea that, cooperatives in the ideal sense insinuate autonomy. And that's actually one of the principles that cooperatives have, even though Poland, I know, has a history of more top-down cooperatives as well, created by government. But in principle, you have this autonomy, you have democratic member control. And so it really lends itself to this idea of giving bottom-up control to the people who are data subjects, for instance. And so I think these are the reasons why we see this sort of complementarity between a lot of what data trusts are trying to do, but also with what these nascent data cooperatives that have begun to emerge in recent years are striving for as well.
By the way, maybe we'll return in a moment. Maybe it will be good to clarify whether there are significant differences in these approaches. But before we do that, I'd like also Katarzyna to give your perspective. And I forgot maybe to mention, of course, in my little retelling, what happened that we did this shift between content and issues like privacy. Obviously, platforms happened, and you've been looking a lot at platforms and in a very specific way as a watchdog, as a civic watchdog. And we agreed that you'll talk a bit in this context about barriers to all these ideas, about more empowerment with data and democratic governance of data.
True. Thank you, Alek, very much for this intro. It already sets a good context for what I'm going to say. So I'm here as a lawyer and activist who has spent last 15 years fighting for autonomy and power over data for the people. That's to put it bluntly. When we started, indeed, we used these concepts of data protection. It was before the GDPR that I assume many of you have heard of, which is the European Data Protection Regulation. So, there was a big fight in front of us, and indeed, we had this awareness that data is power already back then, but I don't think even us, the fighters, had full understanding of what happened with data and to what extent the stakes in this battle will be the data interpreted and observed about people by those entities who have power to do so, because they host content, because they have interfaces that we all use, because they have algorithms analyzing our behavior real time, and they have all the sophisticated algorithms to understand the patterns. We kind of expected that to be the issue, but we didn't, I think, back then took a full account. So indeed, back then I would say personal data the question was how to, for example, take the data you generated somewhere else, or how to make sure that somebody who is processing your data is doing this in a transparent way, deletes if you kindly ask, and maybe explains the goals. From perspective of today, all that seems pretty naive and very simple as compared to what we are facing today. And now, back to the ideas of data trust and cooperatives. When I first heard about these ideas in a big event, like it became big topic of the event, I think it was a Mozilla conference 3 years ago in London, I was sort of lost. I was like, it was exotic concept to me, not because as a lawyer I couldn't get it. I couldn't get why people telling about these structures don't get the power play around data. I mean, like, it's not carte blanche. It's not a situation in which users, even the name triggers even the name reveals our position. We are exploited, we are passive, we are the digital biomass, that's who we are. And they come, I mean, I'm talking with sympathy, of course, I'm not attacking people who come with radical concepts, this is beautiful, but these thinkers come with beautiful concepts to me as if the power play was different, as if we were actually the owners and the producers of data and in capacity of giving it, donating it to trusts or cooperatives. So I couldn't get how they omit that aspect of fighting back, reclaiming control in the first place. It took me a while to understand that these concepts are quite liberal in essence, and they are built on the presumption that people are in control. They produce data, for example, by buying equipment like these bracelets that you can even create yourself or buy and design in a way that indeed it is producing your data that you can hypothetically donate to a trust or a co-op that will fulfill the goals that you like. Fair enough, beautiful, but what about the mainstream? What about the real problem where people are exploited as passive biomass and nobody is giving them access to the key information about them, which is observed and interpreted? Yes, I want you really to get that difference. It's not about the data I provide. Nobody cares what I put in my profile on Facebook. This is nothing. The real power game is about behavioral observation happening real time, all the time, massive amounts of data, not even stored on servers with my name. Not at all. Nobody's doing this. That would be ridiculous, not cost effective and dangerous, because then GDPR comes in and these companies could be, oh my God, forced to reveal that. So nobody's doing this. There is no database with your label, your tag, with all this data. This is stored in a different way. This is preserved as patterns detected by algorithms applied to you as user to manipulate your choices, to surveil you, and to execute power over your life in the digital sphere. And for me, this is this is elephant in the room. And now how do we work around this elephant? Well, EU kind of gave its answer. So in a way, this radical concept, I think they provoked legislators in the European Union to address that power issue, and at the end of that kind of intellectual process, we are now with serious legislative proposals, and I believe we will get back to them later in the discussion, that include that element of reclaiming the power over data, exactly to address that problem. So slowly, we are moving to a legal scenario in which we, the passive biomass, could potentially awake and demand something from the data holders. But even with this new legislative framework, we are very, very far from the situation in which I would like to be, which is I control the behavioral surplus and I decide whether it exists in the first place, and if it exists, for which purpose in society it can be used. We are still very far from that, and even the best proposals at the table right now do not address this problem.
So the elephant in the room, you called it. I wonder what you, Sylvie and Morshed, think. Do we really, is it possible to build these new forms of sort of data sovereignties of people or communities without dealing with the issue of platforms, or is it intrinsically coupled? How do you see it? Sylvie, maybe you want to go first.
I think, yeah, I mean, the data trust idea was actually very much born out of an awareness that there was this considerable power imbalance between us, the users, as Katja says, and these platforms or data controllers. And the idea was, on our own, with this individualized approach to data rights, we are not going to get anywhere. We need to have tools for collective empowerment so that we break the assumption that it's always about individual rights. So data trust and data corps, I think they have this in common, spring from an acknowledgement that when it comes to data, it's high time we come up with tools for collective empowerment and ways for groups to acquire voice, not just individuals having control. I think control is actually, in many cases, an illusion. Whereas in a group, you can actually regain, if you have like 100,000, maybe 1 million people in a data co-op or data trust, suddenly you might have a negotiating power that you would never have a chance to have as an individual. And that can lead you to, for instance, negotiate the terms and conditions that govern the collection of your data, so that you could imagine a scenario where I don't go shopping on Amazon unless my data trustee has negotiated terms and conditions, which mean I log in via my data trust, and the direction of consent has been reversed. And so the whole idea behind data trust is absolutely born out of an acknowledgement, in fact, a commitment to taking very seriously the need to address this power imbalance. And so far, I do not think that top-down regulation is going to be enough on its own. So this is all about saying, if we want to beat this power imbalance and redress it, then we also need to build bottom-up empowerment infrastructure to give a voice to people. And that voice can be used for economic purposes, but also, most importantly, for social and political purposes. And so I think this is really key and important. I'm glad Kasia made her contribution, because it forced me to clarify this. And also, I really think it's important to understand that this is not theory anymore, it's actually practice. The first data trusts are live. It's actually now a core policy priority, both in the UK and in Europe. The DGA is still vague on certain points, but it's very clear that there's going to be some sort of intermediary provisions. I think a lot hangs on how the safeguards are put in place. And the reason I'm interested in data trust, I'll just finish with that, is to say, well, the reason I focus on data trust rather than data co-op is because I believe with these structures, you have to have structures that have the most robust safeguards in place by default. And I worry that when you have a contract-based structure, like most co-ops tend to be focused on contracts, now not all of them, then you risk falling prey to problems down the line, and you risk not truly empowering people. Because if you have to rely on people having to go to court to address or to claim their rights, then you're not really improving the situation that much. Whereas with a trust, there's a court that oversees the trust that can intervene in the absence of any claim, can replace the data trust, etc. But that's not enough. And don't get me wrong, I think we're going to need a lot of layers of regulatory oversight. So there's, of course, the built-in layers, but also I think we need professional layers. Data trustees should be seen as a profession, completely independent, just like we need doctors and lawyers. We need a new profession, data trustees or people running data co-ops. And they need to be held to professional standards. And then we'll probably need also national oversight bodies, etc. I want to stop here because I'm very keen to hear what Morshed has to say. I also think that data co-ops have a very important role to play. They're complementary, but there's this issue around safeguards and how to build them strong enough.
Okay. I think the interesting sort of issue with respect to the DGA is that in its one of its recitals...
Excuse me, maybe we should clarify. DGA, for those that don't know,
is the Data Governance Act.
Important new piece of EU regulation.
Yes, and in one of its recitals it mentions how it wants... it expects that member states are going to introduce fiduciary duties for data intermediating services, which according to the framework of the Act would include data cooperatives as well. And so I expect that while there's quite a bit of heterogeneity when it comes to what data cooperatives look like, and in a recent paper that I've been working on with some others, we look at many different types of data cooperatives which deal with many different sorts of issues. So ranging from the one where it's a lot about donation, which you mentioned, all the way to the ones which are more about trying to improve the asymmetric relation between those who become their members and these platforms. So if we talk about the latter example, we see something like Polypoly, where they created the Polypod as a way of trying to give users more of a decision about what kind of data they share with, for instance, Netflix or not. And so their idea of the cooperative there is that the members collectively own this particular technology that they are developing and continuing to work on, that gives more individual control to their members as well. But of course, there's a collective benefit from this in the sense that they are collectively financing this. And there's, of course, a role for collective governance in that too. Now, this brings me to what I think is a really important point in connection to all of what we're saying, is this distinction between this individualistic approach towards even, it's almost paradoxical, like you have an individualistic approach towards these bottom-up solutions versus a more collective approach as well. So I think in the more ambitious proposals and more radical proposals, we would see that in trying to rebalance this relationship, we would not just try to see that, okay, we are empowering this member to use this particular technology to have control over their data, but these platforms still, implement these data extraction practices, which still continue to exploit a large number of people, especially those who are less tech savvy, those who are not using these technologies and so on. So it doesn't deal with the fundamental problem. Instead, if we combine, I suppose that this data trust and data cooperative approaches, along with new forms of state regulation, we would be able to try to address this from different angles, in a way, sort of like using this, Lawrence Lessig idea of trying to look at the pathetic dot from different ways, right? Like in using looking at the architecture, looking at regulation, looking at governance, and so on. And I think that's going to be really important in terms of empowering the individual to also act collectively and benefiting those who are not just members or are not beneficiaries of a trust as well.
Thanks for mentioning the collective dimension. I think it's really important. I think of it, I don't know, Katarzyna, if you agree, as this post-GDPR sort of thing, where GDPR really betted heavily on individual data portability, which didn't seem to have an impact. I really appreciate these debates on the collective level. There was talk earlier today about the importance of this idea of soul-bound tokens, where in the Web3 debate you suddenly connect individuals with groups. There's very interesting ideas coming out of India, where there's ideas of community data governance. What I find challenging there is figuring out what's the community, right? In some cases it's easy, like taxi drivers in a city, sure, you can probably figure out who they are in one day. But for some more abstract groups, that's for me a bit of a challenge, understanding how these new forms of intermediation might work. But I wanted to ask you, moving a bit on, what's the role of the state here? A lot of these intermediaries are seen as sort of bottom-up. Also in a country like Poland, a lot of ideas of state intervention simply sound risky. At the same time, it's public institutions that often have the capacity to scale. Sylvie, you said a very, for me, inspiring thing, to imagine that this could happen at the scale of hundreds of thousands of people. I usually, when I think co-op, I think something smaller. So does the state intervention, is this important here, or this can happen without the state, or maybe the state can only complicate things? What do you think?
I mean, if you look at me, I would say not so much state, but certainly supranational power structures with real capacity, with real power to impose something on the data holders, yes? So again, back to example that Sylvie gave us 10 minutes ago with negotiating power of collective, of a group of users, people, I'm sorry to, it's just like imposed in my brain, okay, cancer, users, no, humans representing themselves via data trust, coming with the bargaining concept to Amazon. I don't get it, because I've been there. I've been in this situation as a lawyer, as a human being, as an individual. I never got any bargaining position. Terms and conditions are non-negotiable. So somebody with real power has to come in this equation and demand special rights for these new structures. I think indeed thinking in terms of collectives, collective rights, and even more so societal goals like protection of public health or national security or public security or fulfillment of legitimate goals like improving healthcare services or improving transportation, this is the moment where it gets interesting. Because when I come as an individual to Google or Amazon and say, hey, there is 10 of us, give us a better price for a service, like lower the price, take less data from us than you take from others, are we winning anything? I mean, we will get ignored for sure, but even if we didn't get ignored, even if there was 1 million of us, would it be a benefit for the society that my data trust bargained something out of these empires and all the rest of society gets the same exploitation? I am not really comfortable with this idea. So for me, moving from individual to collective and demanding by legal measures imposed by something like the EU, because only them, if anybody, has that bargaining power, demanding something extra for the collectives and for public good, that makes sense to me. But then there are many, many complicated questions. How to ensure that data that get transferred from business to these new structures, or data that is not transferred because it's protected, are actually used for something better than the standard commercial exploitation? How do we prevent, misuses of this? How do we govern these structures? I know us here, we will have these answers. Of course, we have it on paper, but in practice, it is going to be pretty complicated. So for all that, I see actually a role of the legislator, a clever one, a powerful one, because we need somebody to help us get in the ecosystem.
Do you want to respond, Sylvie or Morshed?
Alek, you have to talk to
Sorry, do you want to respond,
Yeah,
Sylvie or Morshed?
I'm happy to respond. I just want to say this. I completely agree. Nobody's going to challenge the idea that it's better if these bottom-up empowerment infrastructures are put to the service of those common goods that are currently not being achieved because we don't share data intelligently and responsibly. So for instance, better use of natural resources, better healthcare, better education. There are many things we could do better if only we enable groups to actually have agency over their data, right? So that is a no-brainer. What I don't want to preempt is, if you think of this as a bottom-up empowerment infrastructure, you don't want to set in advance what these bottom-up empowerment infrastructures can be used for. Now, of course, there need to be limits, yeah? So I do, and I'm actually a fervent defender of the need for top-down regulation, for instance, to limit which data can be monetized and for what purposes. I think we are going to need regulatory intervention on that front. But, and it's a big but, I think if we're going to see more debate and if we're going to break the mold of this habit of passivity that's taken hold when it comes to data governance, you have to also allow for the fact that different structures, different data corps, data trusts, etc., will come up with ideas that we may not have anticipated. And some will be good, some will be bad. And so unless you allow for this kind of grassroots movement, which by definition has a degree of risk, and which by definition will mean that there will need to be further top-down regulation interventions, I think it's really important to give a voice effectively to people who may have their own opinions about what they want to do with this bottom-up empowerment infrastructure. And so I think when I mentioned the Amazon example, it's an important one to me because it's one that can address this idea that the power imbalance cannot only be addressed through top-down regulation. It can also actually, once you have groups and you have groups of significant size, I'm not saying 10 people will never cut it, yeah, you need to have a very large size. But once you say, okay, if you don't talk to us, we're going to exercise the right of portability en masse of like 1 million people and portate that data to an emerging competitor, that's going to change the game, right? And so I'm not saying this is happening today or tomorrow, but I think it could be happening several years down the line. And that would change the power structure, if you want. Anyway, I should stop here.
I think when we come to talk about legislation, looking at the evolution of the Data Governance Act following up on the GDPR is quite illuminating, in the sense that a lot of this discussion, as you mentioned, over the last 3 years, was clearly in the mind of those who worked on the Data Governance Act. But the fact that there are certain, let's say, debris, ideological debris, that is still present in the DGA is quite illuminating. So for instance, the still strong individualistic approach that is still followed in the Data Governance Act, where even by talking about data altruism organizations, talking about different types of data intermediation services like data cooperatives, talking about public sector data governance as well, you still, in the end, looking at the recitals, looking at the articles, you still see this strong, deference towards the individualistic approach that exists in the GDPR. So it sort of shows that in the compromise process that exists within supranational legislative processes, you end up having certain limitations of this top-down approach, even if you have a well-informed, enlightened legislator. I think that's one aspect that's important to bear in mind. And the second is that I feel, because of this compromise process, if we look at how data cooperatives, which now exist not just as a term of art or a term buzzword, but is actually mentioned in the Data Governance Act, you end up actually creating types of path dependencies, and in my view, almost a limitation of what a data cooperative is. As Sylvie mentioned, reality is often more messy, both for good and bad, and the way that this has now been encompassed in this particular new legislation, we see that they have a particular conception of what data cooperatives are and what they expect them to do to fit within that definition. And then the definition itself is very function-based and task-based, rather than giving an actual comprehensive definition that it doesn't even really talk about, democratic member control or these principles that I mentioned with respect to cooperatives. So you then end up creating that, having this top-down legislation that will be influential across the European Union, you end up creating certain types of path dependencies that might end up redirecting or even potentially going at counter purposes to what these bottom-up efforts are doing. So I think there still is a lot of work to be done. I also agree that regulation is going to be a really important aspect of how to deal with the power of data controllers, data extractors, and so on. But I feel that the reason that we need these complementary approaches from both top-down and bottom-up is because of the fact that each of them have these shortcomings in the end.
So we talked extensively in what I think is a very European perspective about how we hope regulation will build a certain framework, but obviously just by naming data cooperatives in a legal act, miracles won't happen. We have 7 minutes left. I want to ask you about these small miracles. Looking forward, what will success look like? Could each of you name one thing that you're hoping will happen that will be a more tangible outcome where you can say, okay, yes, we're seeing alternatives, we're seeing these data intermediaries?
If I can start, I have that concept. Even I already mentioned the event 3 years ago when I've been discussing first time the idea of data trust and co-ops. Back then, at the same event, I presented my concept that I would like to see fulfilled one day, which is New Deal on data. By New Deal on data, I reimagine, within that concept, I reimagine the mainstream scenario, not the radical scenarios at the edges of the ecosystem, but us becoming active agents within the platforms, large online platforms ecosystems like Amazon, Google, Facebook. We already mentioned them. I would like to reimagine that we reclaim our agency within these ecosystems without destroying them, actually. It's not that I don't want them to stop existing. Maybe personally I would like to have that revolutionary scenario, but I appreciate that for many people these platforms are actually instrumental for something and they want to continue functioning there. So my concept, my New Deal on data is not like let's take everything away and go somewhere else and build diaspora and blockchains and all that radical stuff we like, but re-empower people inside platforms. How? the idea is that there should be unbundling of that thing, the same way we have successfully unbundled telco world, where nobody who controls the cables anymore controls, the message that goes via these cables. So in the same way, I imagine that large platforms could operate in separation hosting, separate from interface. We used to go inside that universe, separate from algorithms that today manipulate and exploit us. But I can well imagine nice algorithms that we co-create or train to achieve our goals, and the advertising layer that also is separated. And that's maybe sounds complex, but it's not technically a rocket science, and politically it gains wind, that thinking gains support from politicians. So I think one day we will have it.
Thanks. Sylvie?
My dream is basically to be faced with a scenario where we have a variety of data trusts, data co-ops, and other things we haven't even dreamt about, with basically a flourishing debate because people can argue for the merits of the structure they've just joined, convince another person to actually join another one. And in that process, regulation has also become much more proactive and more sensitive to the needs of a variety of agents in this wide ecosystem. So that's what I hope is basically a much, much more lively scene where we can all learn and keep learning better ways of participating in tomorrow's society via data.
Thank you.
I would just briefly add that in this sort of pluralistic vision that both of them have mentioned, I would also add that I hope the ideal scenario would be that we would have more input from the global south and across digital and gender digital divides that we're seeing with respect to this. You mentioned the example of India already briefly, but I would hope that we would see that the greater input with respect to whether it's being a part of this data new deal or being beneficiaries or members of these data cooperatives, that success to me would be that this would not just be an isolated phenomenon in the global north, but something that would have vibrant and active participation from the global south as well.
Yeah, maybe I'll riff on that to finish up. I was really inspired by this scale you mentioned, Sylvie, of hundreds of thousands, because also earlier today there was talk of how we can build up from really individuals, sort of connecting them together into larger and larger social forms. Ultimately, there's a planetary scale, right? And it sounds science fiction-like to imagine a planetary scale co-op. But who knows, maybe one day we'll get, I think it requires complex technologies, also complex imaginaries, but in the end, probably that would do us a lot of good if some of the data we could manage and also use that data to manage the planet. So that would maybe be my hope. I got to a very big scale.
That assumes we still have a planet in some time. Thank you for the optimism, Alek.
Yes, which is a completely different debate that hopefully we can have some other time. I think we addressed a lot of big topics. Some of them we just briefly mentioned them. I hope at least we gave a sort of general take on this idea. We have just a minute left, maybe. Sylvie, do you still want to say something? I want to double check.
Well, I wish we could have questions from the audience, of course, because I'm very curious to hear what people make of this. So all I would say is please get in touch if you have questions that are left unanswered.
Okay. Good.
We're going to have a nice break here, so we can certainly discuss with our small circle of followers in this discussion in the break.
Yes, so indeed, I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you very much to my panelists, and in 15 minutes, I understand we can all listen to the keynote conversation. Thank you very much.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person, and this for someone else. Maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it and how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Atlas Network is, as the name suggests, a network, and it's global. We work all around the world. We're based in the U.S. We have about 159 partners in the United States right now, and the bulk of our partners are outside, nearly 500 in total.
Atlas Network, it connects people from all over the world, defending the idea of human dignity, defending human rights and personal liberties.
Atlas Network is focusing on, I think, the most important and moral cause in the entire world.
We partner with local innovators, local leaders who understand conditions on the ground in communities facing real challenges. We look at the people from the worldwide freedom movement that are passionate, are ready to make a difference, understand local conditions, and we invest in them.
At Atlas Network, we unleash individual ingenuity to enrich humanity.
The United States does not have a lock on the idea of freedom and liberty. Those ideas are beyond borders.
One of the main goals of Atlas Network is to eradicate poverty around the world, and we do that by investing millions of dollars in our partners' work every year.
Historically, wealthy nations around the world have tried to help low-income countries develop. The way we've been doing it traditionally has not really been working. So there's a movement to do development differently, and that means we need to step back as outsiders and rethink the role that we're playing in helping people in low-income countries achieve their dreams.
We want to make the world a better place. We want to make the world a freer world.
All of us want to leave a legacy and be part of something big to make a better world. This is exactly the work of Atlas Network.
With our growing number of hundreds of successful partners, we're stronger than ever.
Changing the world.
Changing the world.
Changing the world
starts together
with us.